competence management. And that's included things like in-company approaches to workforce development, qualifications and apprenticeships across the UK nations and regions, operating one of the UK's largest independent skills registers, and supporting the European Commission with their European taxonomy of skills, competencies and occupations. But more recently, I've been working with ASFP on their approach to demonstrating competence in passive fire protection. And I'm going to update you on some of the work that we'll be doing in that area today and just give you a bit of a flavour of what you might see coming out of that in the coming months. But before we think about the what, I think it's really important for us to go back and think about the why. So why are we looking at competence now? Well, we all know in June 2017, the Grenfell Tower caught fire. 70 were killed and many more were injured or had their lives changed irrevocably. And that was a trigger for the built environment and the organisations within it to really start to look at their ways of working and think about whether they could have done more. Was it really doing enough to keep people safe? Could Grenfell have been prevented? And how could further tragedy be prevented in future? And the organisations within the built environment weren't the only ones asking those questions. The public was looking on and asking, and the government was looking on and asking as well. Now, this wasn't the first large building fire, and really it's unlikely to be the last. But it was a pivotal moment because it triggered two things. One was an inquiry into why Grenfell had happened in the first place, and the other was an independent review of building regulations and fire safety that was led by Dame Judith Hackett. The final report of that inquiry that she carried out was published in 2018 and was called Building a Safer Future. It's commonly called the Hackett Report instead, after her. There were some really important conclusions from that report, one of them being that people involved in the work in built environment needed to be made truly responsible for their actions. And that was as part of an outcomes-based system, rather than a system that was reliant on complex regulation and guidance. Now, outcomes-based approaches like that really hinge on having competent people that are capable of working safely, people that know how to do the right things, and people that are capable of making the right decisions. In fact, that report mentions competence within it over 150 times. And there's a separate chapter in there that's completely dedicated to competence. And amongst the recommendations that are made as part of that report, one of those is that the construction sector and the fire safety sector should develop continuous improvement approaches to levels of competence. Although the focus of that report was really around high-risk buildings, I think it's fair to say that by extension, we can say that we should be applying the same principles to any of the work that we do. Following those recommendations being made, a number of response groups were set up that were designed to take the recommendations from that report and act on them. And one of those groups that was formed was the Competency Steering Group, or CSG. That was formed from 150 members of industry, and amongst other things has driven production of standards and guidance around competence management in the built environment. Importantly, the report that they produced at the end of their research phase in October 2020 highlighted that we must continue momentum towards implementing change without delay. And that really set out a challenge to industry to take on board the issues with competence that had been identified through the Hackett report and through the Setting the Bar report, and take ownership of those and find solutions for them moving forward. Alongside that, the government was undertaking major regulatory reform. The Building Safety Act was being consulted on, and that became law in April 2022. And that's the biggest change in safety legislation in a whole generation. A major programme of implementation of secondary legislation up to 2024 still carries on today, and that's designed to implement all 53 recommendations that came out of the Hackett report. I'm not intending to go through the details of the Building Safety Act today, I'm sure you'd be pleased to know. If you want to know more about it and how it affects you, I've got other colleagues at ASFP that are far more qualified to have that discussion with you. But the important thing is that there are 3 clear messages coming out that came alongside the implementation of this legislation. and they are that everybody is responsible for safety, that the risks inherent in construction and built environment work must be reduced, and that people are central to that risk reduction. So ultimately, it all comes back to the people that are working within the sector and making them safe. And this, combined with new fire safety regulations that were released in 2022, further enshrines in law the need for people to be competent to do their jobs. And that's further emphasised by the creation of the Building Safety Regulator. And they've been put in place not only to oversee safety and performance in high-risk buildings, but actually to promote individual competence and organisational capability across the built environment. And that means that more emphasis than ever before is being placed upon people's ability to do their jobs, but also on the ability of organisations to help them to do that safely and with the tools that they need. Moreover, the primary message here is one of culture change. It's about embedding a culture of safety and, by extension, competence within organisations in the built environment. And sectors need to be instrumental in that. Government doesn't want to create a stringent pathway that's one size fits all for everyone. What they want to do is promote the sectors to really come up with approaches to competence that are fit for purpose for them and meet their needs. That means we have an opportunity now to look at what we do with competence in passive fire protection. But that opportunity won't be there forever. If we don't step in and do something, the government will have to step in and fill that gap. And I know that's easily said. It's very clear, despite the continuing focus on competence, the landscape around it is really complex. So where did we start with that when we thought about how to support the sector? Well, if we look at the two key areas of individual competence and organisational capability, there are some clear challenges in passive fire protection that we can point to. So currently, UCAS audits and approves certification bodies who certify organisations against their scheme schedules, who, as part of the wider work that they do, look after the competence of individuals who work for them. Now, in terms of organisational capability, we know that there are multiple certification schemes in installation and in products. In some cases, there are significant differences in those schemes, which means that the end user doesn't always know what they're getting if they're employing a certified company. Sometimes the inclusions in those scheme schedules are very light on detail in terms of passive fire protection as well. And UCAS measures what's in the scheme schedules to test compliance, but understandably, they're not experts in passive fire protection. They can't measure those things in the same way that specialists can. In terms of individual competence, there are few industry-agreed benchmarks in passive fire protection across the whole range of activities required to keep people safe. Whether those activities are covered by certification schemes or not, it's really important that we enable people to operate safely. And the lack of specific and consistent mechanisms to do that means that there's differing evaluation of competence when people are making their decisions, and that could lead to problems down the line. For example, if we look at the duties for principal designers and contractors that are emerging as part of the legislation that's coming through, there's a duty there to appoint competent people. But how can you appoint competent people if you don't know what that competence looks like and there's no benchmark? So we need to address that issue to allow the whole system to work better. So there's still quite a bit of work to be done there, and it's becoming increasingly important. And ASFP has a really important role in bringing the sector together to do that. So that ASFP's approach to competence has been designed to directly address those challenges, targeting both organisational capability and individual competence. The purpose of this work is to create a unified approach to competence arrangements across passive fire protection that places organisations at the heart of the process, but with ASFP providing a central mechanism to bring it all together. And it's been widely acknowledged, we've spoken to many stakeholders, that the passive fire sector is stronger if we come to do this together, rather than dealing with it individually in a fragmented way. Now, to do this, the ASFP is going to do three things. Firstly, it's going to work with industry and other relevant stakeholders to create a framework of activities and competencies in passive fire protection. Secondly, it's going to develop an industry-wide scheme to validate individual competence. And thirdly, it's going to create a mechanism to recognise certification schemes that adopt agreed minimum standards for passive fire protection and individual competence. But what does that look like in practice? So let's look at each one in turn. If we first think about organisational capability, ASFP is already working with certification bodies through the certification task group and on a one-to-one basis to look at adoption of minimum requirements for passive fire protection within their scheme schedules. Those things are intended to strengthen the criteria that are already in place, including bringing some standardisation to requirements around things like installer inspection, embedding the use of certified products, and embedding a common approach to addressing individual competence as well. The relationship between UCAS and the certification bodies is maintained, but ASFP will make sure those additional criteria for passive fire protection specifically are met or exceeded. And those people that can do that, those organisations that do that and continue to demonstrate their UCAS accreditation and compliance with those minimum requirements will be offered a quality mark and recognition from ASFP. And that will allow those using and specifying third-party certification schemes to be confident that what they're going to get at the end of that will represent quality. Moving on to individual competence then, the landscape here is changing very quickly, and there's more focus than ever on the need for people to be competent, but it's also clear that we need to give people better mechanisms to allow them to define, develop, measure and validate that competence as well. This was given recognition in the Hackett report and also in setting the bar, and as a result of that, some guidance has already been produced through BSI Flex 8670. It has a very long title, I can never remember what it is, but the crux of it is that it's guidance on how to develop competence frameworks in the built environment. So there's some support already there. It doesn't give the answers, it just gives suggestions and it gives a way of working. What we need to do is take that guidance and apply other things to it and create something that really works for our industry. So we've combined this with our understanding of other sector frameworks and approaches to competence in other industries. And what both those things tell us is that two things are required for individual competence. One is a really clear articulation of what competence looks like. So what areas of competence are we covering? What are the benchmarks for competence that we as an industry are setting? And secondly, we need mechanisms to be able to develop, record and validate that competence. So really clear ways to show people what they need, to help them to get it, and to help them record that they've got it at the end. And the ASFP approach to individual competence addresses both of those things. If we look at the articulation of competence, ASFP is in the process of developing a functional map that extends across passive fire protection. This is designed to set out all of the activities that take place across passive fire protection, so we understand the areas in which we need to develop competence statements. We've chosen an activity-based approach purposely because of a few reasons. But we know that passive fire protection is cross-cutting. It goes across the breadth of industry, and we know in a lot of cases parts of people's roles are about passive fire protection and parts of them are about other parts of construction or other parts of fire safety. So there's a need for flexibility, and it removes the need within occupations to develop lots of different role profiles, because we know that even within common roles within the built environment sector, the actual activities that people undertake or the actual scope of their work might be very different depending on who they're working for. And that means that individuals and employers will be able to select the activities from the framework that are most relevant to them. And it will also allow for trickle-down of activities into non-specialist occupations where they're covering the same processes. The framework extends across 7 domains, all through the building life cycle, right from design and specification through to ownership and occupation. So the intention is to cover everything within that map that touches passive fire protection. It's also split into 5 levels from foundation to authoritative, and they're levels of increasing complexity from I was going to say from bottom to top, from top to bottom on that picture. And they're intended to link to other existing frameworks as well. So they've been mapped to national qualification frameworks, and they've also been mapped to framework levels that are coming out of other working groups or other pieces of work related to competence. Now, we've done quite a lot of work here already. Around 100 activities across the scope of passive fire protection have been identified so far, and that gives us a great starting point for further development of that really clear picture of what competence looks like. That might grow or it might change as we do more work, but at least it gives us a position to start from. If we look at the type of activities that are included in that map, then we can see here some of those included in install at the foundation level. Now, clearly this is an example only. They are activities that are included there, but it's clearly not an exhaustive list. The list here is actually much, much longer. But you can see the granularity with which those activities are being put together. And that'll allow us to have really clear descriptions of what competence that sits underneath them looks like. Once those activities have been defined, we're starting to take those and break them down into statements of what competence looks like. And that's by defining the skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviour that's required for people to perform those functions. So when we talk about skills, we're talking about the things that people need to be able to do. We're talking about knowledge, we're talking about the things they need to know and understand. In experience, we're talking about the application of the skills and knowledge that they need to be able to evidence. And in terms of behaviours, we're really talking about the observable traits or ways of working that we want to see them promote. And that aligns with BSI Flex 8670, so it aligns with all the industry guidance. And it's an approach that allows us to really break down what it is that people need. The initial focus of this activity has been in installation. And the main reason for that is because CSG had priorities around the occupations that were essential to tackle first, and part of that has been in the installation sector. So we've concentrated quite heavily on that to start with, but we're now also looking to move into the design and specification and supply and distribution areas, and we've actually had some really good conversations here this morning with people that are supporting us with their work. Now, throughout this work, we're pulling on existing descriptions of competence where they already exist and they're fit for purpose, such as national occupational standards or agreed industry training standards. Where they aren't fit for purpose, we're looking to fill those gaps, or we're looking to influence back to those standards and get them updated or get the inclusions in them changed slightly. For example, as part of this work, ASFP is leading work on fire stopping through Working Group 2, the installer subgroup of CSG. And as part of this, the outcomes of that work will be adopted back into ASFP's wider framework. So by the time we've done that, no dramas there, right? It's only 100 activities. We'll have that really clear articulation of competence through our functional map and through our statements of skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviour, which have, I have to say, affectionately become known as SCEB statements, which is probably the worst sounding name in the world, but that's what we're calling them now. So what about the other side of it? Well, once we've articulated it, we have to give people the opportunity to evidence that they've met that benchmark. To do that, we need to do two things. One, look at routes to competence. So look at how people can develop towards those, how it can be measured, and how it's aligned to the framework. And two, give them methods to record that they have met that, so that there's a really clear way to see whether people are competent in an activity or not. So if we think about routes to competence first, we're really talking about the recipes that people need to show that they're competent in a particular area. And those recipes might differ depending on the activity that we're talking about, but there are some key elements that are likely to come together in one form or another to demonstrate that. So it could be through regulated qualifications and training. So here we're talking about qualifications that are recognised on national frameworks and formal training that's associated with them. Could be through professional registration, so where registration is already looking for evidence of skills, knowledge and experience to allow people to become part of their membership. It could also be through training, and that could be recognised third-party training, offered outside of ASFP that's adopted into the framework. So that could be by training providers or manufacturers, but it could also be internal ASFP training as well. And we need to combine that with evidence of experience and demonstration of behaviour as well. And it all needs to link back to that framework of competencies in the middle. Now, there are some key considerations here. Although qualifications can be a good measure of initial competence and a good way to check that people have started off on the right level, they aren't the be-all and end-all. Qualifications generally aren't updated over time. You don't often have to go back and do a refresher on a qualification and re-qualify. So although they present a useful starting point, we always need to think about qualifications plus. So if qualifications are involved, what else is required over time to demonstrate competence? We also need to make sure that when training is included, that is high quality training that maps back to that framework in the middle. So ASFPs are also in the process of developing mechanisms to recognise the quality of training and match it back to the framework, to make sure that where people are going through training, we can be sure that they're getting a good experience from that and it's giving them what they need. It also enables us to recognise equivalences in training as well. So there might be more than one way to reach a particular competence, and we need to be able to recognise that within our processes. We also need to think about currency of competence as well. So it's not good enough to just demonstrate competence at one point in time. This needs to live and breathe. We need to be able to recognise people's ability to carry out their work as time goes on. We had a great example of this in another sector with a conversation we were having the other day. We'd had somebody come into industry, get qualified and work, move out of industry for 10 years. And then they came back in and said, I'm just going to start that job again. I've got my qualification. I'll do my health and safety certificate. And they started work again. And they fundamentally didn't have the skills that they needed anymore because they'd been out of industry so long and their industry knowledge wasn't up to scratch. So we need to prevent that from happening in the system that we create. Now, this is designed to create a really flexible approach that's driven and supported by industry. We also know that we need to give people these requirements in a really simple form to allow them to engage with them. So a lot of what we've been talking about here is the wiring. This is how we create the wiring. We'll put a nice front on it to make it really easy for people to engage with. The other thing that ASFP is doing at the moment is creating a system to validate and evidence against the framework. So that will allow individuals to register for competence in the activities that are relevant to them, and provide a central mechanism that brings all of this together and meets the requirements of 8670, but which at the same time is specific to the passive fire protection sector and really meets its need. And that will give support to individuals to demonstrate their own competence, support to organisations to evidence the competence of their workforce, and support to certification bodies to identify that competence benchmarks have been reached as part of their checks on organisational capability. And finally, ASFP is also working on online solutions to bring it all together. We're looking at ways to host the functional map online that might look a bit like this. We're in the process of doing them right now. But to make the requirements really visible to individuals and make it really easy to engage with, but also to allow us to update the wiring that sits behind it if needs be as the sector evolves. That's very much a work in progress. It could look something like this. I think that's the plan at the moment. But it's something that you'll see emerging from ASFP in the coming months. So if we revisit individual competence against organisational capability, what we're talking about for individual competence here is creating a set of tools that allows people to manage their competence at an individual level. That doesn't replace the need for appropriate management. And it needs to be overlaid with checks on organisational capability where possible as well. None of this abdicates organisations from working effectively, from managing underperformance, or from managing issues. And it doesn't prevent people from having to work safely. It doesn't matter if people are competent if they're not being put in a situation where they can work competently. It does, however, show that the organisation is taking reasonable steps to proactively manage workforce competence in a way that's supported by wider industry and independently verified. So, we're making a lot of progress in terms of addressing individual competence and organisational capability in passive fire protection. We know we've still got a long way to go. But new information is going to emerge about this all the time. So keep an eye on what ASFP is doing, and you'll see more progress that we're making in this area as we start to publish the outputs of the work that's ongoing now. In the meantime, I hope that's given you a bit of a view into what it is we're doing at ASFP, and given you more insight into what you'll see coming soon. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take those. I don't know if I should say that out loud. I'd be happy to take those in a minute. If you want to talk about this in more detail, or you feel that you can support this work, then please feel free to approach ASFP, and we'll have a discussion about what we're doing and how we're doing it. Thank you.
I did see the presentation that you gave about a year ago at the conference. And just wanted to pick up on the slide that was 2 or 3 slides back, where you had something that looked like a kind of a page on a website with ASFP Competency. The one before that, I think it was. Yeah.
This one.
So just wondered if you could say a bit more about that in terms of sort of how does that work? Who's filling it in? Who sort of says what's on it's true? Who checks it and so on? Is that ASFP filling it in? Is it the manufacturer filling it in? Could you just elaborate a bit on that?
So the idea is that individuals or the organisations that they work for would be able to submit information directly into that system. Now, it depends on what type of information that is. So we talked about those recipes for competence. It would depend on the type of recipe that we put together in that area. So if it's things like qualification certificates, I think it's me. It's things like qualification certificates, the individuals could submit those themselves. They've already been validated by awarding organisations, so we'd be able to reconcile those and count those against their competence records really easily. Where it's evidence of other training, we would expect that training to have been reviewed and adopted into the system anyway, and that could either be uploaded by an administrator in that training organisation or by another party, or if the individual has evidence, they would be able to upload that themselves. So it's really a range of different ways to interact with it. We need to make sure there are robust processes in place around that to make sure that people aren't uploading invalid evidence or that they're not uploading things that shouldn't be there. And those processes are starting to emerge now. So the way that other registers would do those is they would have a series of things that could come from the individual, a series of things that come from the organisation, and a series of things that had to come from third parties. And that's part of the work that we're figuring out now.
Is that visible to the outside world? Is that like an internal intranet?
Will this mechanism be visible to the outside world? Part of it will be, yeah. If you're talking about in terms of what people are competent for, obviously that would come under GDPR as well, so we'd need to think really carefully about what information was made visible, how it was interrogated and how it was accessed. But that's no different to other registration mechanisms that operate in similar ways. It all needs to be covered off in the process and in the ways of working.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. Just in regards to the transfer to things like competency cards, so obviously CITB is in the industry sort of has the stranglehold on that, and that is certainly with principal contractors, etc., are what they look for. Mm-hmm. Will they be transferring over to that organisation, or will you yourself through this be the recognised body that they'll be looking for when looking at that competency?
Yeah, so you're talking about CSCS cards. The idea at the moment is that we'll have an industry-specific register here, and CSCS will continue to exist and do what they do. The ultimate goal is for this industry register to be affiliated back to CSCS. So you would be able to apply for your CSCS card based on your achievements that are held within this register. I think CSCS does a great job at what it does in terms of confirming occupational competence and allowing access to site. But we know in passive fire protection, the inclusions that are within that record are not granular enough to make any decisions about competence. So this register would give that granularity and would really show what people are capable to do, and it can link back to CSCS, which can give the site access and show competence at an occupational level. So the two elements would still be there, but I guess this is the repository of the detail, and CSCS is the site access part of that. Letting me off easy here, guys. Thank you.